Thanks very much. All right, so let me do the usual here and share my screen, and then I'll get started. Okay. And can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, I'm going to move this secondary thing here. Okay, so I want to begin by obviously thanking the organizers and everyone for coming. It's hard to believe, but this is actually my first Princeton-Bucharest summer seminar talk. And as you're about to hear, I'm planning to be rather ambitious. 3 preliminaries though. First, I'm not going to have much time to reference the extant and growing secondary literature that touches on my topics today, but a brief acknowledgement is warranted. So let's see if my slides will go. Here we are. Second, because it's a rare opportunity for me to do so, I'd like to specifically acknowledge 2 people, Dan Garber and Modi Feingold, who are both here watching and who over the years have both served as very valuable and appreciated mentors and friends. And finally, as a preliminary, a hello to my mom, who said she'd be watching on YouTube. The well-known art historian Martin Kemp rightly acknowledges that the visual legacy of Western medicine is richer than that of any other scientific or technical activity. Indeed, medical historians have for some time been discussing the evidence provided in and by medical art. But Kemp offers historians 2 big cautions. First, there is need to understand each image in terms of the context of its own generation. A representation is made to serve one or more specific functions in particular circumstances and involves a series of choices that reflect the values and priorities of the makers of the image and its intended viewers. We're always presented with what Kemp calls a selective depiction of what is selectively perceived, and this ought not to be ignored. Second, while being responsive to the first concern, there is still the challenge of seeing the images other than through later preconceptions. Different spectators, particularly those from different historical and ethnic cultures, will work with the visual images within different frameworks of expectation and knowledge, frameworks which may entirely transform the original function of the image. So just imagine, as our anatomical knowledge has improved and changed, we think of the images of a past time very differently. Kemp's ideal historian will thus work towards a reconstruction of the original message of the images in terms of functions, intention, and contemporary reception. Questions and topics for the historian include asking about the makers of the images, their motivations, overt and covert, their procedures, the media to which they had access, the particular types of books, paintings, prints, journals, broadcast media, if we expand into the future, and so on that were available. The particular role of visual imagery in any era, not least in relation to verbal records, and the parameters within which contemporary viewing took place. Today, I want to aspire to be the ideal historian Kemp describes, though I can't ask and answer all the questions he proposes. However, the original message of René Descartes' images of the human body and its parts, their function in his work, the intention of their creators, in most cases the editors, and the contemporary reception will be my topic today. For Descartes exercised considerable control over the placement and form of the images in his published work, seeking advice from his correspondents and actively collaborating with draftsmen and the printing houses he chose. As an example of what he achieved, one need only consider any number of the famous images included in the scientific essays accompanying the Discourse or the later Principia. The dioptric specifically includes illustrations containing a realistic depiction of a person and a racket coupled with a geometric image to represent the movement of light in refraction. There's considerable abstraction and idealization taking place here in both the image and in the accompanying text, which work together modeling the techniques of mathematical construction, something that fits nicely with Descartes' repeated insistence that he was guided by the methods of the mathematicians. But not all of the images associated with Descartes are like this one from the dioptrics, even if they all share certain features in common, such as a melding of realism and abstraction. My talk today addresses a subset of Cartesian images, those associated with the human body and its parts, that have been used to cast aspersions on Descartes' attention to observation and description of particulars. That is, his empiricism, as well as his interest in anatomy and competence in dissection. Descartes' explicit references to anatomy or anatomical study begin in 1629 and extend to the end of his life. Yet the image is introduced into the Treatise on Man by the Latin edition's editor and translator in 1662, and the French edition's editor in 1664 have not always been recognized as anatomical images. I've organized my talk into 3 parts today. In the first 2, I'll be discussing images that have received very little attention from scholars. Among the notable topics here will be the choices editors in particular face when handling a manuscript that calls for diagrams. Do you include them? And if so, what's your priority? Are the resulting illustrations merely schematic, or should they include greater naturalistic detail? Are the illustrations a visual demonstration and part of an argument, or merely an aid to memory? In part 3 of my talk, I'll be making 2 claims. The first is uncontroversial, but the second may be controversial, or at least new. First, the vast majority of the images in both versions of the treatise are not intended to represent the visible structure of the body. That is, combined with the text, the images do not describe the actual details of the human body as it is literally seen or felt in dissection. Put in other words, the uncontroversial claim in part 3 of the talk is that there is a gap between the images and the text on the one hand and what can be learned directly through gross anatomy on the other. But how to characterize this gap, what it says about Descartes' empiricism, his reliance on anatomical study and anatomical authorities, and how we should think about the role of these images is a far more complicated issue. It is certainly not resolved with the simple observation that the text concerns what cannot be seen, as is true of so many of Descartes' natural philosophical explanations. And then this brings me to the second claim for part 3. While I think many would agree that the images in the text of the treatise primarily concern the movements and operations of the body, and that the text describes these processes in mechanical terms with explicit comparisons to human-made machines, I see Descartes as repeatedly using the language of anatomical texts, and the editor's images reflecting what we might call the grammar of anatomical illustration. My controversial claim is that we can enrich our understanding of Descartes' treatise by taking into account the grammar of anatomical images and the manner in which anatomy studies the human body. The idea is that the rules of composition for the images are determined by the aspect of anatomy they're meant to convey. Specifically, noting the threefold division of anatomical study, which divides among historia, actio, and usus, or their vernacular translations and equivalents, histoire, history, function, action, usage, use, etc. I want to convince you that Descartes' text and the editor's images are primarily directed at actio, action, as opposed to historia and usus, though the latter do make an appearance in the treatise. Thus, when we look at images like these from the treatise, we're not seeing still lives of actual brains, nor in this case here. If we're expecting to see actual brains as a dissection would reveal them to us, we would surely conclude that the images are, paste my title, lying to us. But let me say something on this topic before turning to my first section of my talk on Galen and the anatomical tradition. So let me say something to clear up a possible ambiguity first. The general question of an image's accuracy and what it might mean for an image to be false, yet not lie. For a naive observer of the earlier images of the brain in the two editions, the one on the left, Schoyle, surely looks more like how such an observer might imagine the brain to look. And traditionally, the naturalistic representation of images in anatomical texts, deriving from Vesalius's De Fabrica from 1543, has been taken to imply that the image is derived from real-world specimens, like a still life, as I mentioned a moment ago. Schoyle did consult cabinets of curiosities, and as a medical student, he would have seen the insides of bodies during dissections. Nevertheless, how we learn to see and what to see in anatomy requires training, something I can attest to from my own experience in medical school. And more to the point, the belief that anatomical images necessarily derive from real-world specimens should not be accepted. Self-consciously adopted techniques in the production of anatomical imagery include enlarging one part of the body more than another to highlight a claim in the text, abstracting away supposedly extraneous or anomalous details, or simply an attempt to persuade that an object actually existed in nature, even though it cannot be seen. As for example, the case of pores in the cardiac septum implies. In other words, even a naturalistic representation should not necessarily call to mind an actual observation of a specific and real object. Did I miss my steno? No, it's right there. Thus, when the distinguished anatomist Nicholas Steno objects to Schoyle's illustrations of the brain in 1663, Steno shows a certain bias about illustrations. There is, I think, an anachronism in Steno's remark that takes Descartes' text and the images provided by Schoyle out of context, though perhaps it would be fairer to judge that the philosophers and physicians had not yet agreed upon the role of anatomical illustrations in the 17th century. Descartes' illustrations generally, and those in the treatise in particular, work in ways both subtle and conspicuous with the written text that scholars have only now begun to consider. The illustrations represent a specific kind of idealized and universal object, and they create meaning with the text. This opens the possibility that the two editions of the treatise, with their different images, create very different meaning with the single text provided. But what Steno misses most of all is that the images in the text are not meant to be instances of historia, built on dissection and observation. Yet this need not imply that they are not anatomical images, as I'm going to try to show. So now to Galen and part one of my talk. So Galen is the founder of the anatomical tradition as it was perceived in the early modern period. For those who don't know, Galen of Pergamum, who lived from 129 to 216 CE, was a polymath who wrote about cancer, logic, philosophy, lexicography, and the anatomy of the brain, among many other topics. In fact, finding something he didn't discuss is the challenge. No less a figure than the peripatetic philosopher Alexander of Aphrodisias put Galen on a par with Plato and Aristotle, the big three. To appreciate the enormity of Galen's contributions and achievement, I prepared this slide you're looking at. Galen left us the most extensive single-authored collection of Greek literature prior to St. John of Chrysostom. Roughly 20% of all surviving Greek literature prior to 350 CE belongs to Galen. So he's the pie there. He's the green part of the pie, and everything else is everything else. So that's over, according to the classicist Vivian Nutton, who tried to quantify Galen's corpus. He produced the equivalent of 2 to 3 pages a day over a working life of some 60 years. That's over 2 million words, 3 million if we count the spurious works. The point vividly captured by the chart, or the graph rather, is that Galen's surviving output dwarfs the surviving output of every other ancient Greek author of poetry or drama or medicine or philosophy. We historians of early modern philosophy ignore him at our peril. Entering into the early modern period, Galen's reception began to change with the excitement of newly shared manuscripts and translations in the Latin West. None more significant than his manual on anatomical procedures. If we look here at the first Latin edition from 1531, we see Galen writing, if we look closely, as a mathematician, like a mathematician. So I've given myself a lot of heartburn trying to translate Galen's invitation to imagine something here. Part of the challenge in my mind is being sensitive to the fact that our translation should not presume a diagram is needed to accompany the text. In other words, the passage might just be encouraging the reader to evoke an image in their minds, and this might be distinct from describing a drawn, printed image. In fact, looking back at the 1531 edition of Anatomical Procedures, you'll notice there is no image. Given a manuscript without an image, the editor chose not to add one. But a different choice was made in 1565 in the edition of Galen's collected works. And again, this is a very schematic representation of the deltoid muscle. Its structure, I'm not sure, but certainly its orientation or shape. A still different choice was made by Cartier in the 17th century. And so this looks more like a chicken bone to me, but you'll notice in the facing columns, the Greek just has the point, as it were. And still further choices were made in the 19th and 20th centuries. Right? So same text, no surviving illustration, editors had to make a choice. Thus, we can find not less than 5 choices and 4 images ranging from the merely schematic, focusing on position or orientation, without any pretense to naturalistic depiction, to something a little more realistic and lifelike. Guiding the editor's choices here is their reading of Galen's text, their interpretation, and the images, when used, surely say something about their interpretation. But more than this, they highlight the different uses to which anatomical illustration could be put. So let's talk about anatomy and how it was defined. The formal definition of the Italian anatomist Cartesian makes reference to what happens in an anatomical theater or during an anatomy, that there's a kind of pointing out and then a series of speculations. And there's reference to a whole host of things that are discovered or demonstrated and then discussed generally. The anatomical lectures of Francis Glisson include a similar list of items working from dissection. These different accounts of anatomy show the rich language of the discipline. In fact, the language is blisteringly sophisticated, And from Galen, the anatomical tradition inherits a dizzying number of distinctions and technical terms. So just to add to the list, here are 11 distinctions, each with its own Greek term, each translated differently, related to the concept of action and use, which was mentioned in each of the definitions I just showed you. Combined together, these distinctions and the elaboration and application in the anatomical tradition represent the most extensive functional analysis and robust expression of teleological thinking available in the early modern period. Actually, functional analysis splits into analysis of action and analysis of use. I'll come back to this difference in a moment, but this is one of those cases where I think we, historians of early modern philosophy, who are tempted to discuss the history of teleology, we talk about Plato and Aristotle, but we don't discuss Galen very much at all. And I think that's, again, something we do to our peril. We impoverish our sense of what's going on in the period. So if action and use were major parts of anatomy, and again, I'll come back to them more in a little bit, and they were major parts of anatomy. The other major aspect of anatomy was historia. So in the definition or account of anatomy provided by De Laurentiis in his Historia Anatomica, he splits it up into two things. There's historical anatomy based on dissection, and then somewhat ambiguously, but I think it's the case, action and use stand separately. They're part of scientific anatomy, and that's because they have to do with the causes of things. In the usage of Vesalius, for example, historia occurred frequently as a term for the textual description, the written record of observation of a part of the body. He prefaced his account of the uterus, for example, by referring specifically to the location, shape, size, construction, substance, insertion of vessels, origins and implantations, and so on, that these are the historia in question. And actually, in something very like this sense, the images in Vesalius's De Fabrica and those we just saw in Galen's On Anatomical Procedures seem to constitute visual historiae of the parts represented and described in the text, though whether they depict a real specimen is, as I indicated, highly doubtful. Thinking ahead to the images from Descartes' Treatise, some, but certainly not all, of Scheele's more closely approximate a visual historiae than do those of Clésellier's edition. We might then recast the uncontroversial claim I tried to make earlier in relation to what will come in section 3 of the talk about the editor's images in Descartes' Treatise by saying that by and large, they fail as instances of visual histories. But if this is correct, do the images succeed in some other way as examples of, say, visual actio or usus, perhaps? And how might an action or operation, let alone a purpose, be visually represented? Good questions that I hope we'll come back to. So let me summarize and expand a bit on what I've said so far. By historia, anatomists meant roughly dissection and the resulting description of the parts of the body. From historia, the anatomist moved on to actio and then usus. Actio refers to the way in which the part moved or operated through the powers of the sensitive or vegetative soul, or the various faculties or virtues. Usus was the end result of its operation. That is, in the case of sensory organs, speaking, hearing, or seeing would be the action, and the use of these activities would refer to the benefit or need these activities fulfilled. Effectively, the benefit the part offered to the living thing, part or action, to the living thing, and the reason the part exists. So typically, as the definitions of anatomy imply, the anatomist would advocate and present his findings by beginning with historia and dissection, moving to study actio in light of historia, and then proceeding to give an argument about usus, often turning back for the reason a part exists to deduce its structure. And I have to caution here, Historia Anatomica is not Baconian history. It's not just an amassing of matters of fact. It's a more directed inquiry related to the action and the usus, or use, as perceived by the anatomist. So Galen himself identifies the move from action to use in his other great work of physiology and theology on the use of the parts, right? Where he says, look, you can't pursue a study of use without already knowing what the action is. Excuse me, but this can't be quite right. The uses of the great sense organs are well known and could be examined in greater detail without any knowledge of their activities. The powers of discrimination of the eye and ear, for example, can be studied intensively without our being obliged to have recourse to any knowledge of the activities of these organs. And conversely, we may know a good deal about the activity without knowing the use of the part or activity. The picture that emerges here in the anatomical tradition and the many advantages to be gained by anatomical study are helpfully conveyed in a fourfold distinction or division that Galen himself makes. The surgeon is Galen's fourth student of anatomy, and on anatomical procedures is directed at this kind of student. And that's why I think the images there are primarily about structure, their histories. They're primarily about making sure the surgeon knows where to cut and what not to cut. It's 1 through 3 that are of greater interest to us, I think. I'm not quite certain what to say about 1. For Galen, 2 is related to the discussion on the use of the parts. But given what Galen goes on to say about 3 as distinct from 2 here, use and action, I think, can be studied separately to an extent, or at least use might minimally require a development of the study of action. Once the investigator ascertains that a part or organ has a purpose, in other words, or a role to play in the living body, that would seem to be enough to satisfy the anatomist who wants to show that nature does nothing in vain. 3, however, says something a bit different. In the latter case, the investigator wants to know not just that a part or organ has a purpose or use, but what it does and how it does it. She wants to understand how her part or organ performs its particular function. That is, she wants to know what the mechanism is. What work does it do and how does it do it? There's a famous example Descartes knew well that relates to this distinction, namely the circulation of the blood. Harvey knew how the movement of the heart and the circulation of the blood worked. But somewhat notoriously, especially for an avowed Aristotelian as Harvey was, he did not know what the circulation of the blood was for. That is, what benefit or use it provided to the living animal. In other words, he knew that the blood circulated. He knew how it did this, but he couldn't tell us why it did it relative to the body's other actions and the needs of the whole. If I'm correct that the anatomist actio is Descartes' focus, which remember, that's going to be my more controversial claim, and that he wants to understand what the body does and how it does it, there are several noteworthy consequences. Right? One might be that he's trying to break out a space different from the 4 benefits described by Galen. He just wants to study the mechanisms of the body. And I think we'll need to ask whether or not he can do that independently of a sense of their use or benefit. But there's another issue as well, something many readers take as obvious, my first claim, should actually be embedded in a tradition, medicine, that they hardly ever notice. So Deborah Brown, for example, who's written perceptively about Descartes' physiology, pauses at one point to notice Descartes' terminology, only to see it through, I think, her own reconstruction. Quote, Descartes' use of functional terminology fonction, usage, utilius, does not signal a reliance on assumptions about purpose or design, but represents instead a shift toward thinking of functional relationships as a special class of brute causal relationships. In fact, I think attention to Descartes' language tells us something about how he viewed causal relationships. There are other consequences that we may discuss if there's time related to matters of anatomical experiment as opposed to theory, interdependence of parts, teleology and design, all of which are richly discussed and theorized in the anatomical tradition, and whether actio can be studied independently of use, as I mentioned a moment ago. But now it's time to talk about Descartes, right? I already mentioned William Harvey and the circulation of the blood, and as many of you know, Descartes accepted Harvey's account of the circulation and promoted Harvey's account, but he resisted Harvey's account of the movement of the heart. One point on which they agreed beyond the circulation, however, was the source or cause of the pulse in the arteries. It was caused by the forceful ejection of blood into the arteries, pressure pressed against the walls of the arteries from inside the lumen. Now, Galen thought differently. Sorry, we're skipping that one and that one, but not this one. Galen thought differently. It was with Galen in mind, yet again for my talk, that Descartes engaged in a polemical back and forth with Plempius. But just appreciate for a moment Galen's view here. His thought is that the arteries themselves are active in drawing blood in from the heart. It's not unlike the way we might use a straw to take in a liquid, right? We create a kind of expansion in our lungs or in our diaphragm, and that pressure change draws the water in. This is how Galen is thinking of the action of the arteries. So when Descartes publishes the Discourse, Plempius is invited by Descartes to offer some responses. And one of the responses he gives makes reference to an experiment Galen performed, the so-called pulse experiment. So basically, here's the idea. And I'm going to skip the two slides I have for purposes of time, which quote Galen on this experiment. You take an artery, you slice it, insert a solid reed, and then you tie it back up. The question is, will you be able to detect anything like a pulse? Okay. Galen thinks you will not be able to do this. And he infers that this is because the movement of the arteries themselves is inhibited by the ligature. It stops the kind of expansion of the arteries themselves. And the hollowness of the reed or the tube, that still allows the movement of blood inside of the artery. So if you can't feel any pulse in the artery distal to the ligature, that's going to imply that it's not the motion of the blood itself, but rather something in the arteries themselves that is the cause of the motion. Now, unsurprisingly, Harvey was aware of this experiment, but he didn't think much of it, and he dismissed it for the reasons here. Descartes takes a different and more elaborate route in response to Plempius, however. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to a translation in the Cottingham that we all know so well, et al., of Descartes' response to Plempius. And I think this actually conveys really the heart of what Descartes wants to say. Effectively, look, even if you perform this experiment successfully, which I'm not going to do, says Descartes, you're going to get the result Galen observes, but let me tell you why. I've got a different story consistent with my own mechanics, but also my own view about how the pulse is created, the source of the pulse. Here's the issue, though, with this translation. If we go to the original, the underlined bit is the bit that gets translated. And then the translation actually picks up after the ellipse on the following page. So there's a lot missing, and as you'll note from the slide here, there's also a diagram missing. So let me just take a second to fill in the ellipses. And again, I'm not gonna spend too much time for purposes of time on the translation here. But what I want you to pick up on, right? So Cunningham gives us the lighter text, and then the darker text is the translation that's missed out on, okay? But if you jump down about midway, let us assume, for example, that BCF is an artery full of blood, as they always are, and into which some new blood is coming from the heart A, and so on. So here Descartes is actually resorting to the same kind of thinking we found initially in Galen on anatomical procedures, right? It's to help you understand what he's just said, or to help you visualize some experiment, take ABC, and so on, right? And Descartes' account here is interesting for the reasons you would expect to someone like me. There's an illustration used, there's a single text, but actually it turns out there are multiple illustrations provided in the tradition. Okay, so I'm gonna skip these translations. So we've seen the first image that Plempius uses. I think I skipped one, sorry, there it is. We already saw the simple woodcut image that Plempius uses, but in 1644, the same year that Plempius publishes that the unabridged version of the correspondence, and in the case of the Latin in these two editions, it's exactly the same. In Bevervikis's epistolary questions, it's the same text, but now we have a different image depicting what's going on in the text. And as it turns out, this same text then gets translated by Clesselier for the correspondence. We have a third image introduced. And I will point out to you that the lowercase d, right, the added artery with something inside of it, there is no lowercase d. And as far as I can tell, there's no justification for the introduction of this added bit of artery in the illustration. And then when Bevervikis's work is translated into Dutch, there is still a new illustration added where the D now becomes a G. So it's clearly dependent upon the image from the correspondence translation. Okay, so for one text, we have at least 6 editors' decisions, right? And I wait patiently and enthusiastically to see the choice that is made in the forthcoming Oxford translations. What image will they use? I'm not sure. So what can we say about these images? Here again, I think that like those in Galen, it's not clear that this is part of the argument so much as it's part of an effort to help visualize what's going on in the description. Help us visualize the structure of the anatomical parts in question. The difference is that there's something added in. There are these reeds or bronze tubes. But again, the point is that a single text presents editors with a challenge when there's no stable image. What image do we use? How do we pursue? How do we make those choices? Finally, we come to the last part of my talk and the choices that I think were made when illustrations were offered for Descartes' treatise on man. So the complex publication history of the treatise is well known to Descartes scholars. Descartes set aside the text in 1633 for 2 apparent reasons. First, it was part of a larger work, The World, which was unambiguously Copernican in its cosmology. Although the content of the treatise is not itself Copernican in any obvious way, when Descartes chose to suppress The World as a result of the 1633 condemnation of Galileo, the treatise was suppressed along with it. A second possible explanation for the suppression of the treatise relates to what Descartes perceived as internal inadequacies in the work and the lack of experimental confirmation for the views expressed. The treatise failed to represent or to present a genetic account of the formation of the animal embryo, as Descartes acknowledged in the discourse when referring to his earlier research, and it never seems to have included an account of plants or the human soul, as had been planned for the work he called his Physics. Regardless of the reasons for the work being withheld, by the late 1640s, Descartes' personal manuscript had been worked on for some 20 years, and by his own account was difficult to read. Several copies had been made, however, and these found their way into the hands of the editors, including supposedly the French original. Now, anyone familiar with the published texts of the treatise knows that they include many images, and Descartes himself left only 2. Thus, the editors had to make or commission their own, and that is what they did. Choisy made his own using mostly, but not exclusively, copper plates, and Clesselier, after considerable effort, secured drawings from Van Gutschoven and Laforge that were used as the basis for wood blocks. Now, if we have now that we have some of the anatomical background in view and some of the terminology in view, I think we can better appreciate the opening paragraph of Descartes' treatise. So I won't read it, but I include the original French and then the Latin. Action or function. So jumping to my controversial claim, I think we should understand Descartes here as setting aside the issue of historia in order to maximize his ability to investigate actio, in order to proceed with as few constraints as possible to seek reductive explanations in terms of what cannot be seen. But this doesn't mean there are no constraints or that the project is somehow arbitrary. If we're interested, as Descartes surely was, in providing a framework for understanding animal movement, and one that specifically proceeds without making reference to the powers of the sensitive or vegetative soul, or the various faculties or virtues typically involved in orthodox discussions of action, then the best way to confirm his supposition would be to see how many movements his supposition could account for. That is, to see how many actions or operations his supposition of the earthen machine might explain. Drawing on the tradition of mechanics, Descartes presses the mechanics strategy as far as he can into anatomy, and such a strategy, as Descartes understands it, means leaving historia behind to consider how the visible effects might be explained, even if only ideally, by appeal to the hidden and ultimately subvisible parts. But again, this does not mean there are no constraints on Descartes' project. One might, however, have the suspicion that Descartes has abandoned anatomy and empiricism with the strategy I've just described. He's left with the wrong constraints, whatever they might be. And such an interpretation of Descartes is not uncommon. Nevertheless, I think jumping to this conclusion would be a mistake. We must take into account Descartes' target in the opening paragraph of the treatise. Although the work is surely part of his natural philosophy, fitting as it does between an account of plants and before an account of the soul insofar as it relates to natural philosophy, if we limit ourselves to Aristotelian textbooks or even Aristotle's corpus, I believe we miss Descartes' true target. Now, there were, of course, Neoplatonists, Hermeticists, and others active in this period who Descartes could have been responding to. But I think it's a challenge from Galen in the opening of his work on natural faculties that Descartes has in view. There, Galen insists that matter without powers is incapable of explaining the changes in living bodies. Roughly for Galen, nature changes matter qualitatively, and nature's craftsmanship includes imparting powers to matter, as happens in living things. Most interestingly, though, Galen believes he has arguments at his disposal to show that no account with a view of matter that does not include powers or genuinely qualitative change is possible. This is Galen's challenge. Descartes in the Treatise supposes the existence of a machine operating by material necessity in an attempt to meet Galen's challenge. Now, what does this mean for the images needed in the Treatise? Well, for Clecelier, who reflects at some length on the images he commissioned and why he did not copy those in the Latin edition, which tried too hard to serve as visual histories for Clecelier's liking, it means that he wanted to find images that make Descartes' text intelligible. Not only does he claim his edition is not built on experience and autopsy, he goes even further in describing the volume he produced. Now, honestly, I'm not so sure about how to handle the last sentence. For one thing, the images of Goodchauvin and Laforge do not always agree. Nevertheless, Laforge agrees with Clecelier's statement when he comments that he, Laforge, was committed less to representing things according to nature than to rendering them intelligible. Surely something similar should be said about von Goodchauvin's images. And as for Scheule, in spite of Clecelier's resistance to those images, many, though by no means all, of the anatomical illustrations from the Latin edition seem to me to leave the pretense of history or historia behind. And even when they do not, they hardly represent what the anatomist sees in the course of dissection. Of those images in both volumes that seem more focused on the intelligibility of Descartes' text are these. Right, which almost seem metaphorical, to go back to a topic that came up at the very beginning, before the talk even began. And what cannot be seen by representing nature, such as animal spirits, or at least the place where they move. So when I talk about intelligibility here, I don't mean, I think I mean two things. I think I mean the intelligibility of the text itself as the editors faced that text, right? Descartes said it was hardly readable, but I think also the fact that all of these illustrations are alluded to, or diagrams are alluded to in the manuscript, leaves the editor with a real challenge. It's not unlike the challenge we saw with Galen's on anatomical procedures, and it's not unlike the challenge that comes up in the correspondence with Plempius. The issue, though, here is that I really don't think the text would make any sense if you didn't include illustrations. It would be almost impossible to read. So there's a greater demand. But there's also an epistemological sense of intelligibility at stake here for the editors, because Descartes' turn to the subvisible, on the one hand, it requires visualization to make sense of it. That seems to be a standard that's pretty prominent in Descartes, and we can obviously talk about that more. But I think there's some sense in which, I'll leave it there, right? That there's also a kind of an epistemological statement in these illustrations as well. Okay, to conclude, nothing I've said today should lead you to doubt the significance of images as a means of shaping and transmitting scientific knowledge in the early modern period. But does this entail that false images never lie? Of course they lie. When taken out of context, images lie all the time. Martin Kemp reminded us in my opening remarks remarks about him, that, you know, when we read these images, when we try to interpret them, we have to look at the context and sort of assume the sorts of knowledge that was available at the time when they were produced. And I think all too often Descartes' images here are taken to misrepresent, or in a way lie to us about the body itself. But that's, I think, an anachronistic reading of these images. The fact that they continue to inspire and be copied is a testament, in fact, to their lasting influence. So in one of the most remarkable hand-drawn student notes I think I've ever seen, here we have one instance in which the illustrations from the Latin edition continue to enter into notes. And I think it's curious, this is both an instance of more visual history or than we find in the rest of the anatomical illustrations. But even so, it's not something you would see in dissection, not quite like this. And there are obviously several others, but let me just call attention to this one. Images copied later in the century, right? And here as well. Okay, so there were some promissory notes that I did not get to in the talk, but I want to end now because I think 50 minutes is more than enough time for me to have spoken. So let me end the slideshow. And do I, you guys, should I stop the sharing? Is that the best strategy?
Yes,
Right.
That's the best strategy. Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, so we have some questions in the chat already. If you have questions, just write them down. Dan, you're first.
Thank you very much, Gideon. I'm going to actually ask you to share once again because my question
Hold on.
is about one of your
And then
slides.
my earpiece is in. Can't hear anything.
And it's about the letter to Papias from February 1638 that you talked. And you put up a series, I think it was of 5 different diagrams of the heart and the artery, and you know, illustrating the experiment from Galen.
Right.
And talked about and said and pointed out that they are in various ways different. But what I'm wondering if you could do is talk about the ways in which you think that they're significantly different. What the different ways in which illustrators to represent the experiment tell us about how it is that they were thinking about it.
Okay, so let me get us back to that, the common illustrations, if that's okay. So I'm going to share my screen again, if I can figure out how to do it. All right, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, so I think one of the most important differences, if you look, follow my cursor here. So do you see an E here, Dan? I hope everybody else. So the pinch there conveys the presence of a ligature. In none of the other illustrations, except for the one that, you know, Adam and Tanner use, which is just a copy of the original Plempius one, is the ligature present.
The ligature is the cut in the vein?
No, the ligature is the tying up, right? So you see how right, it's pressed down against the reed or the tube that's present there, right? So this is actually in one way why I think Plempius's illustration is much better. It conveys what's done in the actual anatomical experiment itself, right? And to an extent, it helps us visualize what's different about the normal state of the artery as opposed to the state introduced into the experiment. And what we're supposed to imagine is that at F, which is just beyond distal to the ligature, there's no felt pulsation. Okay, So I think if you just look at the other illustrations, you might fail to grasp the extent of the intervention just on the basis of the text.
Yep.
In addition, and I think equally importantly, I don't have any idea what lowercase d is and the full G is. Neither of these letters, D, G, appear in the text. So they are in a way accidents of the editors, I think. So in this case, I think the 1663 version just picks up on the 57 one, which again, obviously picked up on the 1644b version.
Remind us what 44b is.
Bever
Or A is
Vicus's.
Plempius is Fundamenta Medicinus.
Right. A is Plempius, right. And then this is those epistolary questions. All right. So these readers here, it's not clear how carefully they read it, right? And so it suggests a kind of indifference to that portion of the text. Again, as I was saying, like G and D don't even appear in the text. And I think the accident here is likely that, or at least Eric Jan Boss suggested this to me when we were talking about this, that the editor here just went, oh yeah, A, B, C, D, oh, that was a mistake, D, I'm just gonna add after F, G, right? Okay, so stepping back for a moment, we as historians of philosophy, or as philosophers generally, I think when I was an undergraduate, Stanley Cavell once said this, that you take every word seriously as a philosopher, right? So when you're reading any text, any word can mean everything, right? Which is a fine idea and a fine hermeneutic strategy. But, you know, the writers that we associate with these texts, Descartes, whoever it may be, especially in the early modern period, they weren't always the final word on punctuation, word order, let alone illustrations. And so I think we have to be somewhat circumspect about the editorial choices that sometimes go into the works we read so carefully and take so seriously. Or at least it's a question I think worth asking. So again, I think these different illustrations call our attention to that a bit. Does that answer the question? I hope so, Dan.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe we can stop the screen sharing briefly, and Fabrizio has a follow-up to this.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
How are you doing, by the way? How's your...
Thank you very much, Gideon. Yes, you answered my question while answering Dan's. Well, I was wondering whether there are differences perhaps in the text Plemp reported in Fundamenta Medicinae, if we compare it to Van Beverwyck, for example, for this case, because there are differences in general in the letters in the Adam Tannery edition in Van Beverwyck and the Plemp. So maybe there are even differences for this case, this specific case you were presenting.
Yeah, so I'm both happy and dismayed to report I went word for word through the two editions for the relevant portion of the letter. So for those who don't know, that 1638, Plempius publishes an abridged version of the correspondence with Descartes and basically just cuts all of Descartes out. And Descartes doesn't know this. Regius calls it, and Descartes is pretty pissed. I don't know if I should say that on YouTube, but anyway, so he's pretty angry. And then the full version of the letters are published, in theory at least, in 1644 in the two editions I mentioned. In the case of all of the Descartes' response here, the Latin is exactly the same with the exception of punctuation and a few commas. So okay. Word order, spelling, just about exactly the same.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. So it really is a case of a single text, different images.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dolores? I think you're muted.
So Gideon, thanks so much. That's all really, really helpful. So I have to back up and ask whether I'm understanding your frame of reference correctly. So so you're trying to read Descartes within the historical context of what physicians would be thinking about in terms of a kind of the anatomy of man, but also the history of man. So there's a whole tradition of the history of man texts that are being written across Europe, certainly from the 16th century onward, not only drawing on Galen, but are also drawing on Hippocrates and Hippocrates' idea of having to know all of nature in order to be able to understand man. So do you see, so it's a two-part question.
Okay.
Do you see what Descartes is trying to do as trying to be yet another voice in the quest, quest for a true history of man, which has been reevaluated since the publication of Vesalius's De Fabrica, because they find out actually, Galen got all these things wrong, and so Galen loses credibility. But at the same time, we have Galen's Hippocrates, because most of the Hippocratic texts that we have are from Galen, and there's a rise of Hippocratism, which very much states that medicine and philosophy have to be done together, and that makes sense of your first idea, your first category of that one has to. One would be a benefit to the man of science, but it's really the physicos. So I'm sorry, this is a little fragmented, but so do you see Descartes as part of the long tradition of trying to redefine the history of man since the 16th century? And if he's doing that, is he not only using Galen as a target, but really the Hippocratic corpus and Galen as a target? Because all the great series of writers who are writing on the history of man are trying to reconcile ancient theories with new modern theories. So you have things in England like the history of man sucked from the sap of the most approved anatomists in the present age, etc. by Bannister. You get things like Purchas's Pilgrim's Microcosmos. You get things like, The Wonders of the Little World, A General History of Man in 6 books, etc. And they're all trying to draw on ancient texts, both Hippocratic and Galenic, and then, as it were, synthesize it so that they've got a credible idea about the history of man in the early modern period. Now that
okay, so I think I got. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you?
Well, there's one more thing which I think might be relevant, which is, so the usual, as everyone knows, the usual line is that this happens as a response to Vesalius in 1543. But as early as 1477, we get Arabic texts coming into the West and to France and Holland and England and Italy about the dictates of the sayings of philosophers. And if you look at the different books of those dictates, more than half are medical. And so the last part of my question is, does Descartes draw on these Arabic sources?
Okay, I could answer the last question, the last part of the question, I think pretty easily, which is no, I don't think so. So is Descartes interested in a new history of man? I mean, let's frame the question in those terms, because there were a lot of parts there, Dolores. And
Okay.
I don't know that I picked up on all of them, right? So it is true that Descartes accepts two things. That there's been a decline in the kind of knowledge we seem to have with respect to ourselves since antiquity. And the surest indication of this is that he accepts that some of the early figures described in the Bible lived hundreds of years.
Right.
But that kind of longevity isn't available to us because of the medical knowledge that's been lost, right? So does he buy the kind of response to Vesalius that Sylvius and others had, which is that, you know, Galen wasn't wrong, he was just describing different human beings with human bodies, and de-evolution since antiquity, so that literally our bodies have changed. No, I don't think Descartes goes anywhere in that direction, but he does think that there's been a decline in knowledge, joining with a long rhetorical tradition in this regard. And he sees himself as equipped to reclaim that loss of knowledge, or at least the practical benefits can be reclaimed that that loss has deprived us of.
Does he get that from Bacon, or where does he? I mean, he takes up that.
I think it's just everywhere.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I think it's just everywhere. And one point of caution about citing Vesalius and this kind of rise of Historia. So I think one part of what happens in the 17th century that Harvey is a party to is that there is, as others like Andrew Weir and Gianna Pomata have talked about, there is a kind of rise in the status of Historia within the medical tradition.
Right.
So if Harvey is willing to publish an account that includes both Historia and Actio with respect to the circulation of the blood, but he's doesn't have anything to say about Usus at that point, but it's still worthy of being published. If you jump ahead to Malpighi's work on the liver,
right,
and you know, Nico Meli has written really, I think, quite clearly on this stuff. You know, he finds himself publishing just about Historia, and he's not even talking about Actio or Usus at all at that point. He's got no clue with
right.
respect to the liver, right? So there's a rise in this stuff about Historia as a genre, and you know, a justifying publication. But at the same time, if you look at Vesalius's images as instances of visual Historia, and they clearly are, and he talks about them in those terms, he is subsequently criticized quite harshly by members of the Paduan medical community, Eustachius, Fallopius, Fabricius, for emphasizing Historia to the exclusion of Actio and Usus.
Right.
So there's a counter pressure there. So where does Descartes come in with the Hippocratic tradition? I think, look, I don't have a good answer to that question. I will flag for everyone, though, that one of the influences of the Hippocratic text in the 17th century relates to what was perceived, at least in England, in the second half of the 17th century, as Hippocratic mechanism.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a part of the story of the history of the mechanical philosophy that has yet to be fully told, as far as I'm concerned. There's a really excellent paper by called like no, not Mark. It's called Hippocratic Iatromechanism by Bonnie, I think, and it's one of the only things on the subject that I know of.
Okay, just one aside, and then I'll be quiet. About the circulation of the blood, not having a good example of why that's the case. Harvey uses the weather cycle in Aristotle's Meteorology as a kind of explanation for why the circulation of the blood is as a natural phenomenon. And that, I thought maybe perhaps Descartes was using, you know, the world and the man as a kind of take on a Harveyan idea of the Aristotelian weather cycle.
Well, actually, there's a reference in that regard in the Principles too, when Descartes mentions the circulation of the blood there and comparing it to the weather. Yeah, that microcosm, macrocosm stuff, I think the framework for Descartes is different enough in how he's thinking about this, that even though there's some basis for saying there's a parallel between the two, it's not quite the parallel you find in the earlier tradition or even in Harvey, right? Because the parallel is the uniformity of the way in which matter moves in the heavens and in the earth. That's the kind of microcosm, macrocosm I think you're going to find, if you're going to find one at all in Descartes.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. So Bill Eaton was both next in line and had something to ask about Vesalius, so that works out well. Bill,
Please.
are you muted?
You already answered my question, so thanks.
Okay. Then a short
Thanks, Bill.
question.
Great talk, though. Great, fascinating stuff.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay, so next in line, Ade Artis with a point about the Greek text.
I don't know. Can you hear me?
I can. You're loud and clear.
Okay, great. As far as I could tell, it was like first came you had the image of the Latin edition, and then you went through a number of subsequent editions, and in one of those, the Greek text on the left had the 3 points.
Correct.
And so I'm wondering, were those, I mean, to your knowledge, were those in the Greek manuscripts?
Okay, so super good question. The 1529 Greek edition of Galen that became the basis for the subsequent Latin translations, I haven't actually had a chance to see or look at. You know, I blame the pandemic and finding out that you know, my kids aren't going back to school here in LA in the fall.
That sucks.
So no, I haven't looked. You know, I'd be surprised if they were there, but it wouldn't be, you know, it wouldn't be crazy that there would be dots added by someone copying that manuscript who read it and thought, oh, let me just provide some orientation here. That's kind of key. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me.
Part of the reason I ask is that I've often wondered, I haven't had the time to find out, but I've often wondered about a lot of, say, the Greek mathematical texts like Euclid, let's say, that are getting kind of resurrected at this time period, whether or not the diagrams are in the manuscripts.
But again, remember, those manuscripts are copied by people who are going to have different priorities, right? There's it's a manuscript culture that's
tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, you know, the other thing that I would say is that, no, I guess I can leave it there. I mean, I think I've sort of answered, right? I've answered the question. I mean, one thing I will point out is that even in the 19th century Kuhn-Galen volumes, he includes on the facing pages, just like that 17th century edition. And Kuhn basically just co-opted the earlier Latin translations, right? So he also has just dots in the Greek, and then his sort of chicken bone diagram, the deltoid muscle. I will say one further thing, which is that there is a second image indicated on Anatomical Procedures toward the very end of the book. And again, it's about a muscle in the macaque monkey. And it's got a kind of trapezoid orientation or structure. And that illustration is also provided in the later Latin and English and translated editions of On Anatomical Procedures, but there's no indication from what I've seen so far that it exists in the earlier ones, just the text, no diagram.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So next we have a couple of questions about the use of images in Descartes. So first, Torrin Baker.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a great talk.
Hey, Torrin, how you doing, man?
Good, thank you. So I guess I have this question about Descartes' inversion of the sort of epistemological, I guess the Aristotelian, even Galenic epistemological approach, starting from metaphysics and then doing physics and so on, and anatomy would end up somewhere further down the road. The image tradition just prior to Descartes, sorry, would start with either illustrations of how to dissect or primarily illustrations of historia, what you ought to see or what ought to be cataloged in the body first. And then if you see later images, there might be schematic images I don't see it so much in the Actio, except that Vesalius does have some little images that I think illustrate Actio a little bit. But primarily in the Usu section, you might have diagrams talking, you see this in Fabricius, for example. So those diagrams in later sections of anatomical works seem much more similar to Descartes' diagrams, which he's doing by omitting those first sort of dissectio diagrams. And so I'm wondering if there's a mirroring there that you can point to, if that makes sense, or if there's something, or just, the mechanical tradition rather is the dominant sort of image approach that he's taking.
Formation or background, yeah. Or the mathematical tradition too, right?
Sure.
Okay, so good stuff. It's an excellent question. And, there's, again, the kind of diagrams you find in mixed mathematics, which you've written about yourself, Darren, right? So let me respond to what I hear as two questions, okay? So the first is about the kind of metaphysics, physics structure that seems to be implied by Descartes and how that plays out here. So, of course, you may have come into the talk expecting me to at some point press together Descartes' metaphysics and his physics. And I've got things to say about that, and I think it's really important. But at the same time, I think part of what happens in our discussion about Descartes in this regard is people recognize that there are two parts that you have to kind of compare and relate to one another. And there's a lot of study of the metaphysics, but the perception is that in the case of the natural philosophy, and specifically, I think in the case of the physiological or quasi-anatomical stuff, you don't need to spend a great deal of time figuring out what he's actually doing, what practices he's embracing, what his language is like, where it comes from, and so on. And so, for those of us interested in kind of the high metaphysics of Suarez and so on, my talk may have fallen a bit flat, but I think that we really do need to spend time assessing both independently, as it were, because they exist independently in his world. He spent far more time doing the study of medicine than he did doing metaphysics, right? So it's worth just pausing over that realization and working out what's going on in this one sphere. So I don't think the tree is going to provide too much guidance. I think in the end, as readers of Descartes, we're going to want to ask ourselves questions about how the parts fit together. And in fact, I think, though I didn't press this issue at all hard, except to gesture to it, that the resources that emerged from the anatomical tradition that informed Descartes' practice in the Treatise on Man and elsewhere set us up for, I think, understanding some of those metaphysical claims about, if not final causation exactly, but the legitimate role and way to understand the ideal construction of the human being in a way that you just won't appreciate if you don't throw a more careful understanding of the physiology and Galen as background, or at least the anatomical tradition into the story. Okay, that's on that side. Now, your other question about, does Descartes, is he really drawing on the anatomical tradition, or are the influences coming from elsewhere? And it's not quite the way you phrased it, but that's sort of how I'm going to hear it, right? So I think Descartes is better read in the history of medicine and the anatomical tradition than that's often thought. Fabrizio has indicated, and I think he's right about this when he writes about Descartes' medical sources, that during the period in which Descartes is hanging out with Plempius in the early 1630s, so Plempius is working on a Dutch translation of one of the major anatomical atlases of the time. In fact, Plempius introduces much of Dutch anatomical language in his late 20s, I think, early 30s version of that atlas. And then Plempius is also, as you know, working on the eye and ophthalmological issues. At the same time, he's hanging out with Descartes. And then in the full back and forth that Plempius and Descartes have, there's a clear shared sense of text that they have worked through together. I mean, they make references to these texts back and forth quite easily in the letters, right? So I think it's very possible that Descartes is, he's just like bypassing the Historia stuff because it doesn't resolve the questions he's most interested in. Specifically, it doesn't resolve the question of how you offer a mechanical account or how you investigate actio when you know that the parts of the body are both invisible and then sometimes in principle invisible. So he untethers that project from the dissection in Historia. But at the same time, it's not totally untethered because he will, among other things, he of course cites all these mechanical analogies with mechanisms or machines and artifacts that we know quite well. But also in the treatise and elsewhere, he will cite analogies to other better known anatomical discoveries. And perhaps the best example of this are the valves in the veins, the heart, and in the brain. He cites those to justify his kind of extrapolation to the presence of valves in the nerves. That's mechanical in a sense. It, in a sense, comes from the mechanical tradition because Fabricius himself describes those valves in the veins by analogies to mechanical instruments that hold back water in canals. But at the same time, Descartes is going beyond that stuff by citing other anatomical discoveries, right? So I think the relationship is fairly complicated. That's not to deny that these other traditions aren't influencing him, but my goal today was to kind of turn on the neon light on this one side.
Thank you. So Mattia Mantovani also had a question in this area. I don't know if it was like fully answered yet. Mattia, do you?
Oh, not fully. If I can ask my. Hi there, Gideon, by the way. Great talk.
Hi.
Lots of questions to ask. Just a few things. Could you please say something more on the differences, whether there are differences there, between the set of illustrations by Raoul, Laforge, and Van Richthofen? So you were speaking that they were all relating somehow to represent actio, but I wanted to know more about it, how they relate to them. Also in relation to the legacy of Descartes' images. So for example, if you go in Germany, for example, of course they had access to the Latin version of the work, and indeed the images there reflect the images by Raoul. And in general, what do you think is going on in anatomy after Descartes' work? Whether do you think that this intention of images to portray actio over Historia was successful, or whether it was immediately abandoned? Steno was apparently rejecting it. There are letters of Borelli to Malpighi where Borelli is saying you should use the same images as Descartes, which seems to suggest that Borelli was more sympathetic to this kind of style, visual style. So these kind of things I would like to know more about. Thanks.
Yeah. So, the alternative title I considered for my talk was a grossly or grotesquely ambitious talk, right? Because I have some things I would like to say about these issues, especially about the legacy stuff, but I just couldn't fit it in. So I appreciate your asking about it, right? So the first thing to say about the legacy, and then I'll turn to what I think is an equally challenging question about clearing up how actio plays out in the different images. So about the legacy, I think there are two answers I want to give. So the first is that Descartes is pushing against a tidal wave here. Right? So my own sense of what happens to anatomical illustrations in the 17th century is that, as I mentioned a bit a while ago, Historia is, as it were, on the rise. It's on the ascent, okay? And Descartes, by trying to push away from Historia, it's not that he doesn't achieve a great deal with these illustrations, because it provides to some, including Steno, I think, a sense that there's something to be learned about the mechanical parts to whole operation of bodies. But what you're not going to learn is that this is how an actual body anywhere is really made, okay? So they have some success in that regard, but they're not embraced within the anatomical tradition itself, because that tradition is no longer taking too strong of an interest in usus or actio in terms of the illustrations. The priority is getting the historia right. This goes hand in hand with a broader movement in the late 17th century and I think an anachronistic reading, slightly unfair of Descartes, that like, look, you can't do science without careful experimentation and sense-based data. And Descartes doesn't seem to have that, you know, and so he becomes, in the eyes of Royal Society figures, who Peter Anstie has written quite nicely about, the model of a speculative thinker. Okay, and again, I think that's a bit unfair. I think it's a slightly anachronistic reading of Descartes that happens almost immediately after his death. You know, the microscope contributes to that, but even so, right? And by citing Borelli, so Borelli's reference to Malpighi is just that there are advantages to depicting the body in the way Descartes does. And that could include including the images so close to the text, but also slightly more schematic on occasion. But again, I think Descartes is kind of pushing against the tidal wave here. Okay. Now the issue of actio. I mean, I think in some ways the initial evidence here is just that nobody in their right mind should think that these images that Descartes is calling for are instances of historia understood as dissection-driven, sense-based data about the body. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's not actually just the illustrations themselves. Descartes' text is similarly focused on the nexus of terms that go with actio, right? Functio, officium is a bit tricky. Sometimes that looks like usus, sometimes not. But the point is that the text itself, when read in relation to the terminology of the anatomical tradition itself, is almost entirely focused on actio. And then the illustrations themselves, I think if you take that in view or keep that in mind, they are not telling us how any actual body is really structured or oriented or how it could actually be seen. They're trying to depict the way in which some cause is produced. And that's precisely what actio and an anatomist's interest in actio is all about. I hope that goes some way to answering the question. I mean, it's a good question. Both are good questions. Thanks.
So Dana Jalobano has a finger on this, or a connected question at least.
Right. Yes. Just in a way, generalizing the last point that Gideon made. I was wondering whether this is not a more general strategy of Descartes in his other texts. I was kind of keeping in mind now his images, various kinds of cosmological images, or his drawing of the magnet, or, you know, all sorts of heuristic and pedagogical images he's using here and there in his principles, which are precise. I mean, it's a striking similarity. So given the question is, in which way it went from his freedom and liberality in representing physical phenomena towards anatomy, or the other way around?
Okay, good question, hard question. So in some ways it piggybacks onto a point that Tarwin was making, that look, there are ways in which you can imagine these images fitting more easily with or influenced by fields we also know Descartes was very motivated by, like mixed mathematics, mathematics more generally, and so on, right? So to make your question harder for me, even, right? So you have to imagine that when Descartes starts to sit down and work on what comes to be the manuscript of the world, there are illustrations implied, diagrams implied in the Treatise on Light. And the Treatise on Man is just a kind of adding on to that initial effort, right? It's all part of one broader work of physics. So it seems like we could tell a whole story maybe about the Treatise on Man and those physiological images without making any reference to the other material that I've tried to cite, right? So maybe this is a case, I've thought about that. And I've thought also about the illustrations that appear in the essays, right? Which are, some of them also include looking in at the inner workings of the human body, right? Especially in the dioptrics. So I think those are these other traditions and Descartes' general tendency here, they can be partially explained by these other traditions that you mentioned. But his competence in visualizing or imagining these subvisible mechanisms and the descriptions he gives and the language he uses is unquestionably, in my mind, linked with the anatomical tradition for some of the reasons I've mentioned. So does it mean, I don't think we have to choose which was the single source, right? I think they, supported and encouraged each other, right? So for example, one of the things that one should take from Denis Duchenne's work is that the theater of the machine tradition, it gives you a lot of what you need to understand what Descartes is on about in the Treatise on Man, and also what his illustrations are meant to accomplish. What's missing, though, I think, is that tradition is itself not totally independent from the kind of factors that influenced the anatomical tradition in the 16th and into the 17th century too. They are part of a broader cultural practice. And I'm just trying to fill in some of that gap here. Right?
Dan Garber has a finger list.
Yeah, no, I'm just wondering about that, Gideon. One of the things I found very helpful when you were talking about the anatomical illustrations was this distinction between historia actio and usus in anatomy. And if you think, for example, about the magnet, if you think, for example, about cosmology, usus is certainly not an issue. I actually think historia isn't really an issue. I mean, think about the magnet. Descartes certainly did not observe those screw-shaped particles that play such a role in his illustration of the magnet. It really is much actio. How is it the thing works?
Exactly. No, I totally agree. I mean, and I think at one point in my talk today, I suggested that, part of what he does is he presses this mechanical way of thinking that is described in part 4 of the principles. He seems to apply it to these anatomical or physiological questions that he's interested in. So yes, I think there's a kind of continuity there. The thing is, though, that the vocabulary he uses, again, in this context, seems to me particularly ripe in the anatomical tradition. And I would actually go so far, to put my cards on the table, since there are only 22 minutes left, I would go so far as to suggest that you're going to gain a great deal of insight into the way Descartes is thinking about parts and wholes, and which objects are God's created things, and so on, if you look at the anatomical tradition, not if you look at the mechanical tradition, in part because it's so tightly woven with conceptions of the human body and human nature. So I don't know that, maybe this is what Dolores was trying to get me to see, but I think to the extent that human beings are a metaphysical puzzle and as well as a priority in Descartes, the entry into that material at its most sophisticated comes, I think, from the anatomical tradition. That is from the side of the physics into the metaphysics. It doesn't come from the mechanical tradition. So I guess another way to put that is, I think I wholly agree, Dan, but I think the metaphysical payoff is much clearer to see when you come from the medical tradition, not when you come from the mechanical tradition.
Thank you.
Dolores actually wants to come in on this, and then I think we'll move on to the main question list with Philip. So Dolores.
Sorry, Gideon, I don't mean to be a gadfly, but pressing the physiological tradition, to what extent is Descartes trying to answer Fresnel on the hidden causes of things?
Well, I mean, Descartes, yeah, I mean, so Descartes doesn't believe in such a thing as occult anatomy, right? I mean, there's things that can't be seen, but in a way that doesn't mean they're hidden from understanding. And that's, if you want to say that that's a response to part of what Fresnel is on about, then yes, I do. I mean, you know, Gilson and now Phil Sloan and others have tried to, and I think Peter has done this too, and I think I did a long time ago in my dissertation, have tried to link Descartes with Fresnel. But I don't think you can lay all of what I've tried to press out here at the feet of Fresnel. I think there's a lot more going on. So Tarwin's work, for example, on the eye, I think the Descartes' early interest in geometrical optics kind of balloons into an interest in the anatomy of the eye. And from there, it balloons into a general interest in anatomy. I think that's the best evidence we have about the route into these issues. But, you know, that ballooning changes, I think, the way he really thinks about things.
Okay, great. Philip?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gideon, for your talk. I have a question concerning the epistemological value of visualizations that you have mentioned. A question which you have in the meantime already touched in your answers. However, several scholars, Kopp, Wilson, Maley included, have argued there was in the 17th century a significant shift from realistic visualizations towards conceptual visualizations. As you know, Vesalius and anatomists belonging to his tradition, such as Bidlaw, included hyper-realistic portraits often made by professional artists, such as a collaborator of Caravaggio, or copied from Vesalius. By contrast, anatomists such as Steno, Swammerdam, Malpighi, etc., included rather conceptual illustrations. These were no realistic illustrations. Proportions were not respected, structures which were considered to be important were shown much bigger, substructures were extracted from their context, there was no attention, there was much more attention for evolution and motion in the structures, etc. Often these illustrations were very abstract, completely different from the hyperrealistic illustrations in Vesalius' work. Don't you think that this significant shift played a role in the text you have shown? Do you have any thoughts perhaps on this?
Sure. So thanks for the question. I don't think actually I've seen you in some years, so it's nice to see you today. So one initial note of caution, which is that the talk of the hyper-realistic, in Vesalius, you know, the muscle men are represented in perfect proportion. You know, the way you learn it in art class about the body being so many lengths of the head and so on. And there are several instances in Vesalius, and it's not me who's discovered this, but of him either creating or vastly enlarging parts of the representation of the body for various reasons, right? So that's not to deny that in some quarters there is a move to this more conceptual thinking about illustrations, but just that first note of caution. And I think some of that caution applies to the images in the Latin edition of the Treatise on Man, which are sometimes discussed as though they're very realistic and so on. Okay, I would press this point slightly differently, I guess. So I'm not trying to give a non-answer, but I'm going to give a semi-non-answer. I think the real issue or dispute, you might say, is between those who think illustration should be included at all and those who do not. I think that's the bigger division that emerges in the 17th century, right? And there's some dispute about it earlier. I mean, Rialdo Colombo, he apparently wanted to have illustrations in his work, following on Vesalius, but he only managed to get a frontispiece. Plempius, who publishes his work on the eye in 1632, he specifically says, you don't use illustrations, and my work on the eye here has none. Harvey, in his later work in particular, laments the use of illustrations and doesn't think they should be used at all. In spite of the fact that one of the most sort of creative and innovative uses of an illustration to convey both Actio and I think Usus appear in the 4 images in his treatise, in the work on the motion of the heart. Right, so the real center, and Steno doesn't have any illustrations, right? At least in his lectures on the brain. Yeah, so that's where I think the real action is, as it were. And then after that, there will be people who do end up using illustrations with a certain amount of reticence, and they become the ones who are the conceptual depictors, as it were. Descartes has seemingly no reticence at all in using illustrations. But he's also somehow, if not conceptual, at least he's interested in the Actio more than anything else. So I think he stands a bit apart from the traditions you were trying to call our attention to. I think I had something else I wanted to say, but I forgot. Sorry.
Okay, but I think also you might acknowledge also that those who made illustrations or included them in their publications differed from each other. Take, for instance, Bidlo. He's different from Malpighi or Swammerdam, or this is a significant difference. That's another tradition, if I may say so, than the let's say Vesalius tradition.
Okay, no, it's a point well taken. And I mean, look, one of the things that has to be taken into account is once these magnifying glasses start to be used after Descartes' death to visualize what had previously been an invisible world, it puts a certain kind of premium on allowing those without access to those things to see what's actually seen in that world. And that, again, creates a lot of, it's not conceptual, but it's very Historia-oriented depictions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Philip.
So Hanok Benyami had 2 questions. Ask one or both, as you wish.
I want to ask, thanks very much. Thanks, Gideon, and nice.
It's nice to see you.
I want to ask the second question because it was very similar to Dan's, and actually Dan wrote his finger at the same time that I wrote my second question. So I'll go to my first, if it's okay, because it's not on images. It's about the specific experiment, and I find it really interesting. So what did Galen see? The way he describes it, he did the experiment very carefully and the pulse stopped once you had a full ligature. And now Harvey gives good reasons why it would be difficult to do that. But Galen doesn't sound as bluffing. And when I wrote my first question, I thought Descartes might be right. But now I doubt it, because Descartes says the pulse reduces because the quill is narrower than the artery. But it was earlier, even when you had the cut only along the artery and you put it into it. So, and then Galen says he saw the pulse. And also, you know, it's not difficult to take an artery and just press it a little without cutting it at all. And if Descartes were right, that should stop the pulse behind the artery. So do you have, you know, given your medical background, perhaps, any idea what happened there?
Yes, I totally do. I haven't performed the experiment myself, but do you want to get out your second question too, or do you want me to answer this one?
The second question was, again, the parallels with the illustrations in physics and theology, and this is what Dan asked. So please.
Okay, so let me have at this. So the first thing to say is this experiment would be incredibly messy, all right? It would be incredibly messy. And one thing that's deceptive about Descartes' illustrations, at least the ones that are used in 1644 and elsewhere, is that the insertion of the reed is placed incredibly close to the heart. And that's not how the experiment is described by Plempius. By Galen. Galen would have used probably the hind leg of a pig, his preferred object of study. Okay, so what do you actually find? Well, part of the answer here is what causes the pulse in the periphery of the body. So the first thing is that, in fact, the pulse of the artery is fairly weak in the periphery, okay? So the first thing you have to realize. The second thing is that the pulse is actually caused by two things. There is no active motion of the arteries. They don't expand like the lungs do and suck something in. There's nothing like that perception. However, what is the primary source of the pulse in the periphery is a vibration created in the arterial wall at the moment of systolic compression and elevation of the heart, okay? So that's one of the concomitant factors producing the pulse in the periphery. The other is, in fact, pressure exerted on the arterial wall from the motion of the blood. So if we were to perform this experiment as a Los Angeles physician did in the 1950s and report our results, what would we find? So we would find that, in fact, you can detect a very moderate pulse distal to the ligature and the reed. It exists. It's very small because the vibration along the arterial wall, the tunic of the artery, is inhibited by the ligature. Now, for those of us who are getting older, arterial sclerosis produces the exact same effect. So the heart continues to pump, but the arteries are less susceptible to the reception of the vibration and passing it along. You can still detect you can still detect the pulse in people with arterial sclerosis in the periphery of the body, but it will be diminished, right? The felt pulse will be diminished. So that's the first thing to say. It's like, you know, Galen just didn't see it right. Now, why didn't they see it right? Well, I mean, again, these are incredibly messy experiments he's describing. Harvey suggests as much. But Galen was also an experimenter of unparalleled skill. And it's clear, as you said, that he wasn't messing around. He really did these things, and he probably did them publicly, and he probably did them often, or at least more than once. I mean, I have more, I guess I could say, about why his experimental results, as I said, it'd be diminished. The pulse would be hard to detect, sure. There are also, separately, I would say, curious questions about fluid dynamics involved here, right? So I'm not going to start talking about Bernoulli. I don't know if Marius is on the call. I'll leave it to him. But so, when you have Descartes is sort of right about this in some ways. I mean, when you have a pipe that's filled with a fluid, an incompressible fluid like water, or in this case, blood, and it moves, as it would in this case, into a smaller reed, you have a larger diameter tube than a smaller one than a larger one. So what happens to the fluid? Because it's under a kind of continuous flow, that means that the blood, as it enters the reed, speeds up, but its pressure goes down. And then when that blood leaves the reed, its speed decreases, but its pressure increases. And that would actually suggest, contrary to Descartes' description of the perceived result, that you should feel or detect some pulse distal to the ligature. So, in some ways I want to say it's a complete mess. That's the answer. This experiment would be very messy. But these are the factors, or these are the kinds of considerations that would enter into how you would have to analyze it.
But it's interesting. So first, thanks very much for the really detailed answer. But it's interesting that Galen had a point. The vibrations you described, this is something that comes from higher up in the system. The way he thought something must be coming up, and probably he had a limited ability to notice the reduced pulse. So he was he nicely based his view on experimental results as well. That's impressive.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's right. And I think, just as another neon sign for the history of medicine, as we talk about controlled experiment as an emerging tradition in the 17th century, there's a kind of proto-scientific view of experimentation that you have to, if you look, you find in this anatomical tradition. I mean, the words, the Latin used by both Descartes and Plempius, they refer to what Galen's doing as experiments. It's no accident. I mean, there's some of the most incredible controlled experiments in the history of physiology are to Galen.
Thank you very much. So last set of questions from Richard Stryer. Maybe please ask them together because we only have a few minutes left. Are you Richard?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine, Richard.
Okay, I had two questions. They're not exactly related. One is a sort of history of the book question, which is, what difference does print make to the history of medical illustrations, since there seems to be a remarkable continuity from manuscript to print? And then the second question is really a kind of what I heard from much of what you said. And the question is, would it be fair to say that Descartes is doing physics rather than biology in relation to the body? And that's a way of sort of understanding the differences in the use of illustrations.
Okay, thanks. So, Richard, I don't think I've seen you around since I was a graduate student at Chicago. So it's been a while. It's nice to see you.
I didn't even know you were a grad student at Chicago. How wonderful.
Yeah, I was Dan's last philosophy student. So I was actually thinking about this today. I've known Dan for longer than probably both of us care to remember. All right, so.
Almost as long as I've known Dan.
Probably longer. All right, so in reverse order.
Not longer. We were in graduate school together.
Oh my gosh, yes, so that is longer. Okay, so in reverse order, physics versus biology. So I want to say no, and in part I want to say no because there is no biology in the 17th century. I mean, this kind of is a rhetorical move that some historians complain about, right? That biology as a term isn't really coined until a student of Wolff's, Michael Hanov, in the middle of the 18th century used it, I think 1766. Okay, so there's no single discipline that studies living things in the 17th century, but it's as a shorthand, and I'm not trying to blame you, I mean, it makes sense to do it, and the reasons to do it, as a shorthand to describe what might be an alternative tradition in the 17th century, it's often used by historians of philosophy. Like there's biology and then there's physics, and they represent these distinct fields. One of the reasons that I find myself uncomfortable with that, and this isn't just meant to be a kind of historian's complaint or whine about it, but one of the reasons I find myself uncomfortable with that is it completely pushes aside medicine in the story. Medicine was a term used in the period. It was its own distinct field of study. There were dedicated faculty whose positions were either in theoretical or practical medicine or in surgery. And so I want to be cautious about how we present the contrast. And there's the further point that physiologia and physica are terms broadly used in the period to include, to some extent at least, the study of living things, for sure. So I don't know that I think that contrast will prove illuminating in the end. That's not to say that there's obviously a question you're asking behind the terminology. And the question is, look, if he's interested in just matter and motion, that makes sense of his illustrations as opposed to the kind of full-blooded complexity that biological living things seem to have. And my own inclination is Descartes actually is quite sensitive to the latter, to that complexity, but he has a very focused approach to it. And that's what I see these illustrations doing. And I don't think Pace, Dan, and others, that approach is, can be, all right, so in disagreement with Dan and others, maybe, I don't know that approach can be attributed solely to the physics or the physica tradition. Not least of all because, as Christoph Lüthi is born now, I mean, nobody's using illustrations in that physics tradition in a way before Descartes. Now for your other question, book history of the book, right? So what was her name? Eisenstein, is that the author from the 70s? Yeah, so Eisenstein's 2-volume stuff on this and the significance of book culture and so on. It's incredibly interesting. It's, I think, deeply unpersuasive in the end about how it contrasts manuscript culture with book culture. However, to the extent that she's really got a point, she is at her best when she's talking about the medical anatomical tradition. So I think that the history of the book, one of the ways it obviously contributes to anatomical illustration is that it presents the possibility of consistent common images that can be published in Germany, right, in Eastern Europe, in Italy, and elsewhere. And those images can be roughly copied and reused. So it presents the possibility of a standardization. And
do the images themselves change when they go into print? That's the question, really.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there have to be changes. There are constraints, right? There's issues of cost. There are too many players for them not to change. But to push back a bit on what I've just said, you'll have noticed in the PowerPoint, I included an image that Susanna Berger was kind enough to send me of a hand illustration done of one of the plates from the Latin edition of the Treatise on Man. I think that the separation, the cleavage that's sometimes created between book culture and manuscript culture is not quite so pronounced. That's why Eisenstein is wrong. And I think here, in that case, you can see it in that instance of drawing and copying.
That's really what I was getting at, is it looks to me like, especially with the more conceptual illustrations, there's really a continuity.
Yeah, maybe I should have just said, yeah, that's a good point, Richard.
Okay, well, we are out of time. Thank you very much, Gideon. Before we give Gideon a round of applause, just to announce what we're doing next week. We're doing something we've never done before in this format. We're going to attempt a reading group. So Scott Mandelbrot will send around a few short texts related to Newton, and he's going to do a short presentation, and then we're going to try to ask questions and discuss. So tune in next week. And now maybe unmute your microphones and give Gideon a round of applause.
Can I just say one thing? Oh.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks very much, everybody. The one thing I wanted to say is, my promissory note about pressing these issues into some of the metaphysical questions, I just want to say one thing about them. In Meditation 6, when Descartes finally sort of seems to make room for the prospect of finalism and teleological thinking in connection with the union between mind and body, I think that the best resources for understanding that discussion actually come from Galen's account of why we have the best possible body we can. It has to do with the goodness of the demiurge. And one of the things that's shared in those two cases, Meditation 6 and Galen's discussion, is the fact that creation occurs under constraint. So the demiurge, in the nice Platonic tradition, confronts a receptacle of the world and is constrained by it. God, by the time you get to Meditation 6, is constrained by the matter God has willed to exist. And then the issue is, how do you create the best arrangement possible? All of those issues play out in Galen in an incredibly sophisticated way. And one day I'm going to finish my paper about that.
What is the text, Gideon? What is the Galen text?
Well, it's on the use of the parts, but it's all over the place.
Okay, so maybe a hand for
Can we
Gideon
applaud
and
now?
Galen. Yes.
Sorry. Thanks, everybody. Anyway, thanks for coming and sticking it out, everybody. 2 hours and 5 minutes.